The gray paint had begun to peel at the corners of Albert Trask's porch that autumn, curling back like old bark from a dead tree, and not a single soul in Harlan Creek, Texas, thought he would do a thing about it except mix another bucket of the same tired gray and slap it back on before the first freeze came. That was simply how Albert Trask was. He was a man of absolute habit, the kind of habit that other people in town had long since stopped questioning, the way you stop questioning why the sun rises in the east or why the Rio Grande bends the way it does below the flats. He had painted that house gray in 1862, the autumn after his wife Alina had passed from fever, and he had painted it gray every third year since, always in October, always alone, always mixing the same ash and white until he arrived at that particular shade that existed somewhere between storm cloud and morning fog. Nobody asked him why anymore. Old Pete Gruber at the hardware store just ordered the ash pigment special when Albert came in, and the exchange was as wordless and efficient as the changing of the seasons. Albert was 41 years old in the autumn of 1882, when Lavinia Brenner stepped off the southbound stage from Abilene with a carpetbag in one hand and a leather satchel worn thin at the strap in the other, and a look on her face like a woman who had already survived several things that would have broken most people, and was merely waiting to see what this new place intended to try. She was 29. Tall for a woman, with dark brown hair she kept pinned at the nape of her neck in a loose knot that always seemed to be threatening to come undone by midday. Her eyes were the color of creek water in late September, that particular green-gray that is neither one thing nor the other, and manages somehow to be more striking for it. She wore a brown traveling dress that had been fine once and still carried itself well, the way a good horse carries itself well even after a long road. She had come from Missouri originally, by way of Kansas, by way of a marriage that had ended not in death, but in the kind of quiet dissolution that the frontier sometimes produced when two people found themselves working the same dry plot of earth for 5 years, without once managing to speak honestly to each other. The divorce had been legal, quietly handled by a judge in Abilene who had the grace not to look at her with too much pity, and she had taken her maiden name back with the same efficiency with which she had packed her carpetbag and boarded the stage. Harlan Creek was not her destination so much as her stopping place. She had a letter from a woman named Ruth Alderson, who ran the town's only millinery and dry goods counter, offering her a position as a shopkeeper's assistant for a fair wage and a room above the shop. Ruth had gotten her name from the Abilene Women's Employment Register, which was a small but earnest organization run by 3 Quaker women who believed that a woman ought to be able to make her own living without apology. Lavinia believed this too, fiercely, in the practical and unsentimental way that a woman who has had to build herself back from nothing tends to believe things. The stage stopped in front of the Harlan Creek Post Office and General Store, which occupied a long, low building of unpainted timber on the main road. The town stretched out from there in both directions, modest and functional, the way frontier towns were in those years: a livery stable, a church, a saloon that doubled as a meeting hall, a barber shop, a blacksmith's forge, a schoolhouse set back from the road 100 yards, and several dozen houses arranged with the practical randomness of people who had simply built where the ground was level enough. Albert Trask's house stood at the north end of the main road, just where it curved toward the open range. It was a solid house, 2 stories, with a broad porch that he had built himself the year after Alina died, because building things had given his hands something to do during the long evenings. The gray paint covered every board of it, every post and rail, so that in certain lights, particularly on overcast mornings, the house seemed to barely exist, to fade into the sky behind it like a faint pencil sketch of what a house might look like rather than the thing itself. Lavinia did not notice the house on that first day because she had too many immediate things to manage: finding Ruth Alderson's shop, being shown her room, eating her first meal in town, which was a bowl of venison stew at the boarding house table, and orienting herself to the geography of a new place the way she always did, methodically, quietly, storing away details like a woman building a map inside her head. She met Albert Trask 3 days later, which was a Friday. He came into Ruth's shop for a new pair of work gloves, the thick leather kind with the reinforced palms that ranchers wore for fence work, and he came in the same way he apparently did everything, directly, without dawdling, with the slightly abstracted expression of a man whose mind was already half on the next task before the current one was finished. He was a large man, not in the way of bulk but in the way of presence, broad-shouldered and straight-backed, with the kind of weathered face that the Texas sun produces in men who spend most of their lives outdoors. His hair was dark brown going silver at the temples, and he wore it short and neat. His eyes were a steady, unremarkable brown, the kind of eyes that do not announce themselves, and that you consequently keep returning to, trying to read something in them that they seem to be keeping carefully still. Lavinia was arranging a new display of spooled thread when he came in, and she looked up and said good morning in the easy, professional way she had already developed for customers, and he said good morning in return and asked after the leather work gloves, and she found them for him without any fuss, and that was the entirety of their first meeting. He paid, thanked her with a short nod, and left. Ruth, who was a stout, cheerful woman in her 50s with the observational powers of a hawk, watched this exchange from behind her counter and said nothing, which was itself somewhat unusual for Ruth. Lavinia thought nothing of it at all. She finished the thread display and moved on to cataloging a new shipment of calico that had arrived on the same stage she had come in on, and by the time she went to bed that evening, she had not given Albert Trask a single additional thought. That changed incrementally over the following weeks, the way things that matter tend to change, not in a sudden flash, but in the slow accumulation of small observations that you do not realize are accumulating until one day you notice the weight of them. She noticed first that he came into the shop every Friday morning, regular as the church bell, always for something practical, a spool of wire, a new axe handle, ammunition for a Winchester rifle that she gathered he kept for the occasional coyote problem along the fence lines of his ranch. He ran a cattle operation north of town. She learned from Ruth, modest by Texas standards but solid, about 400 head on good grassland, and he worked it largely alone with the help of 2 hands, brothers named Santos and Emilio Vega, who had been with him for 7 years. He was known as a fair employer, a quiet neighbor, a man who showed up reliably when someone in town needed help barn raisings, fence repairs after storms, the occasional stretch of road that needed grading before winter. He was also known as a man who did not talk much about himself, which Ruth said with the particular mixture of admiration and mild frustration that the town seemed to reserve for Albert Trask as a whole. Lavinia began to look forward to Friday mornings in a way she was careful not to examine too closely at first. She was a practical woman, and she had been burned once, and she was not in any hurry to be foolish again. But there was something about the quality of his silence that she found unexpectedly restful, something in the way he moved through the shop with that focused quietness, never browsing, never lingering past his purpose, but always pausing when he paid to say something brief and courteous that showed he was paying attention to his surroundings in a way that the more talkative customers often were not. In November, he came in on a Tuesday, which was unusual, and she was near the door sorting wool blankets when he came in and nearly stepped on a bolt of fabric she had leaned against the display table. He caught it before it fell, steadied it with one hand, and set it back against the table with a care that was entirely automatic and entirely genuine, and when he looked up and found her watching him, he said, "You probably had a reason for where that was," which she found such an unexpectedly thoughtful thing to say that she smiled before she could stop herself. "I did," she said, "and now you have moved it and I will have to think about it all over again." "I apologize for that," he said, and the thing was he sounded as though he actually did in a quiet and unpretentious way. "Don't worry about it," she said. "I was going to change it anyway." He bought a new lantern wick and left, and she stood for a moment after the door had swung closed and thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she liked him. Not in any grand or complicated way, but in the simple, durable way you like something that is honest and does not pretend to be other than it is. December came with a hard, cold front that moved down from the north and left a skim of ice on the horse troughs every morning for 2 weeks. Albert came in one Friday with the collar of his coat turned up and a look of quiet resignation to the cold that she found very funny for some reason she could not quite articulate, and she said, "You look like a man who has lost an argument with the weather." He looked at her with what she had come to recognize as the closest he usually came to surprise, a very slight widening of those steady brown eyes, and he said, "The weather argues in ways that are very difficult to counter." "I find that to be true," she said. "You are from further north," he said. "Missouri," she said. "Then Kansas." "More winter there," he said. "More winter everywhere I have been," she said. "I was hoping Texas might be different." "Usually it is," he said. "This is unusual." "That seems to be a consistent feature of my experience," she said, meaning the weather, though she was aware as she said it that it was true of more things than the weather, and she watched his face to see if he understood the wider truth of it, and something in the slight set of his mouth suggested that he might. He left without having bought anything, which she only realized several minutes later, and which she found oddly significant, in the way that small departures from pattern sometimes are. Christmas in Harlan Creek was a modest, community affair, a church service, a shared supper at the community hall, some decorated greenery along the main road that the schoolchildren had put up with their teacher, a young woman from Ohio named Miss Carver who had arrived in town only 6 months before Lavinia and had already demonstrated an impressive ability to organize other people's children. Lavinia helped Ruth bake pies for the community supper and found herself, for the first time since leaving Kansas, genuinely glad to be somewhere. Albert came to the community supper and sat at the far end of the long table with Santos and Emilio Vega, who had brought their wives and 3 small children between them, and the table was lively and warm around him. He ate steadily and said things occasionally that made the people nearest him laugh, which surprised Lavinia, because she had not thought of him as a man who made people laugh, and she revised her picture of him slightly. After supper, when people were moving around and talking, and the children were chasing each other between the tables, she found herself standing near him by the edge of the room where 2 cups of hot cider were sitting on a window ledge, and he handed her one without being asked, which was the kind of casual, attentive gesture that she had noticed was characteristic of him, small acts of consideration that he seemed to perform without calculation, simply because they were the obvious right thing to do in that moment. "Merry Christmas, Miss Brenner," he said. "Merry Christmas, Mr. Trask," she said. "You have a way of appearing with exactly what a person needs before they know they need it." He looked at his own cup. "My mother was particular about noticing what people needed," he said. "I think I caught the habit from her." "That is a good habit to have caught," she said. They stood for a moment with the noise of the room around them, comfortable in a way that neither of them seemed to feel the need to fill with additional words, and Lavinia thought that this was rarer than people generally acknowledged, this ease of shared silence, and she was careful with it. The way you are careful with something that you sense is fragile not because it is weak, but because it is fine-grained, because it depends on a particular quality of attention that the wrong word could easily disrupt. "You have settled in well," he said presently. "Ruth speaks highly of you." "Ruth is generous," Lavinia said. "I speak highly of her as well. She has been kind to me." "She is a good judge of people," he said. "She does not speak highly of everyone." Lavinia looked at him. "Are you suggesting that my qualities are independently verified?" she said. The corner of his mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. I am suggesting that her assessment and my own are in agreement, he said. He said it simply, without any of the performative quality that compliments from men so often carried, and she felt her heart do a brief, quiet thing that she chose not to overanalyze on Christmas evening when the cider was warm and the room was full of light. "Thank you," she said. "That is kind." "It is true," he said, and that was all. January was gray and still and very cold, and Harlan Creek drew inward the way small towns do in deep winter, contracting around the stoves and hearths, and the shop was slower, and Lavinia used the time to reorganize the inventory system, creating a written ledger that was more detailed than the one Ruth had been keeping for years. And Ruth approved of this enthusiastically and immediately delegated the entire bookkeeping operation to her, which suited Lavinia perfectly, because she had always found order in numbers that she could not always find in other places. Albert came in on his usual Fridays, and they talked a little more each time, the way people do when they have established that the other person is safe to talk to, when the low-level wariness that everyone carries in new acquaintances has been slowly, quietly discharged. She learned that he had been born in Virginia in 1841, that he had come west as a young man before the war, that he had lost his wife Eleanor in 1862 to the typhoid fever that swept through several counties that year, that they had been married only 2 years before she died, that they had no children. She learned that he had built the ranch house himself on land he had earned through 5 years of cattle work for another man, a patient and deliberate process that she recognized as characteristic of how he appeared to do everything. She learned that he read, which she had not expected, and that he had a preference for natural history and exploration accounts. Lewis and Clark, John Wesley Powell's survey of the Colorado River, though he also kept a worn copy of Shakespeare's complete works that had belonged to Eleanor and that he read occasionally, not sentimentally, but because she had told him once it was important to know what words were capable of, and he had found she was right. She told him in return about Missouri, about her parents who had been small farmers of German immigrant stock, practical and loving people who had given her a solid education and a thorough knowledge of hard work. She told him about Kansas with less detail, enough for him to understand the shape of it without her having to describe its interior, and he received this with the same attentiveness he gave everything without pressure, without prurient curiosity, with a quiet acknowledgement that said he understood there were parts of a person's life that they carried in their own way and on their own schedule. In February, there was a problem with his water line. A section of iron pipe that ran from the well to the house had cracked in the hard freeze and flooded one side of the yard when the thaw came. He came into the shop on a Wednesday for pipe fittings and joining compound, and when she helped him calculate the length of pipe he would need from the measurements he had brought, working it out on a slip of paper at the counter, he watched her quick arithmetic with an expression she could not read and then said, "You were a teacher." "I taught school for 2 years in Missouri," she said, surprised. "Before I married. How did you know?" "The way you do arithmetic," he said. "You talk it through the way a person who has taught does." Making the process visible, she stared at him for a moment. "That is very observant," she said. "I pay attention," he said, and again it was simple and matter-of-fact, and she thought, not for the first time, that there was something quietly extraordinary about a man who said things like that without any apparent awareness that they were extraordinary. She helped him carry the pipe fittings out to his wagon, which was waiting in front of the shop, and they stood in the weak February sunlight for a moment before he climbed up to the seat, and she looked at his house at the end of the road, visible from where they stood, its gray expanse flat and colorless against the pale winter sky, and she said, without having planned to, "Your house is very gray." He looked at it for a moment. "Yes," he said. "Has it always been that color?" she asked. "Since 1862, he said, and the date carried enough weight in it that she understood without needing to ask further. She nodded, and he clicked to the horse and the wagon moved away, and she stood on the frozen dirt road watching it go and felt something in her chest that was complicated and tender, and that she recognized, finally, for what it was. March came in rough and then softened, the way March does in Texas, with warm days appearing between cold ones like promises that kept getting interrupted. The range was greening up along the south-facing slopes, and the creek ran high with snowmelt from further north, and Harlan Creek expanded back into itself the way it did every spring, people spending more time outdoors, more traffic on the main road, more noise and color returning to the town after the long monochrome of winter. Lavinia had begun walking in the evenings after the shop closed, a habit she had maintained since Missouri, finding that it cleared her thinking and gave her body something to do with the energy that accumulated from a day of mostly indoor work. Her usual route took her up the main road and then left along the creek trail for half a mile before doubling back, and she began to notice Albert's house with a different kind of attention on those walks, the way you begin to notice something that has previously existed only in the peripheral register of your awareness and has now moved to the center. It was gray in the way that very few things in nature are gray. Most gray things in the natural world have other colors in them, the blue in storm clouds, the green in certain stones, the lavender in morning shadows. Albert's house had none of that. It was a pure, unmodulated gray, the color of ash and resignation, and she found herself thinking about it more than was strictly warranted, thinking about the man who had chosen it and continued choosing it for 20 years, painting over it every third autumn with the same shade, and what that said about him, and whether it was a sorrow he was maintaining or a protection he was providing himself, or perhaps both at once, which was often the way of things. One evening in late March, she was passing the house on her walk when she found him on the porch, sitting in one of the 2 chairs he kept there, reading in the last of the evening light. He saw her and raised a hand in acknowledgement, and she slowed, and he said, "Evening, Miss Brenner," and she said, "Evening, Mr. Trask," and then, because she had been thinking about it for weeks, she asked, "What is your favorite color?" He looked up from the book. The evening light was golden across his face and across the gray boards of the porch around him, and there was a quality to his stillness in that moment that was different from his usual stillness, slightly more internal, as though the question had reached somewhere deeper than questions usually reached. He did not answer immediately. He set the book down on his knee and looked out toward the road, and then toward the horizon where the last of the sun was painting the sky in shades of amber and deep rose. "Nobody has asked me that in a long time," he said. "I am asking now," she said, standing at the gate, her hands resting on the top rail of the fence, her face open and curious and without any particular agenda except genuine wanting to know. He was quiet for a moment longer. Then he said, "Blue." "Blue," she repeated. "The particular blue of the sky about an hour before dusk in summer," he said, "when it is deep but not yet dark, when it still has light in it but you can see the stars beginning." She held that answer for a moment, looking at him sitting there in his gray house with the deep, considered color of that answer living in the air between them. "That is a very specific blue," she said. "Yes," he said. "Why gray then?" she asked, and her voice was gentle and direct and not unkind. He looked at the house around him. "I started it gray when a leaner died," he said, "and I kept on with it. I suppose I stopped thinking it was a choice and started thinking it was just what the house was." She nodded slowly. "Sometimes we make choices that outlive the reasons we made them," she said. He looked at her with that slight intensification of expression that was his version of being moved by something. "That is true," he said. "Blue would suit it," she said. "I think." "You think so," he said, and there was something in his voice that was almost wondering. "The cornflower kind," she said. "Light but clear, not gray at all." She said good evening then and continued her walk, and he watched her go, and the golden evening light caught her dark hair as she moved away, and it was only after she was out of sight that he realized he had been holding the closed book against his chest for the last several minutes without having noticed he had moved it there. The following week he came into the shop and bought 4 gallons of white base paint and a quantity of blue pigment. And Lavinia, who was behind the counter, looked at the purchase and then looked at him and said nothing at all, only smiled in a way that was small and private and entirely genuine. And he paid for it and carried it out to the wagon with the slightly charged air of a man who has decided something large and is still in the early, tender stages of having decided it. Santos Vega, who had driven the wagon that day and was waiting out front, watched Albert load the paint with a raised eyebrow and said, in Spanish, "Blue." And Albert said, in English, "Blue," and Santos looked back at the shop door and then at Albert and said nothing more, though the look on his face said considerable things. Albert mixed the paint himself that Saturday, working in the barn with the large wooden paddle he used for the purpose, testing the color against the white of a mixing board until it reached the shade he had described, that deep, clear, light-filled blue that sat at the particular hour before dusk in summer. It was not cornflower exactly, though it was close to what Lavinia had suggested, and when he held the painted board up against the gray wall of the house and looked at the contrast, something in him that had been very quiet for a very long time shifted, cautiously, towards something less quiet. He began painting that Sunday morning, starting with the south wall that faced the road, the wall most visible from the main street of Harlan Creek, and he worked steadily through the morning and into the afternoon. And by the time the light was going in the early evening, he had covered a third of the house, and the south wall blazed with that deep clear blue against the surrounding gray like a window opened in a closed room. Word spread through Harlan Creek with the speed that word of anything new and visual spreads through a small town, and by Monday morning 3 different people had mentioned it to Lavinia in the shop, all of them with some variant of the same expression, which was mild collective bewilderment shading into pleasure, the community's recognition that something had shifted in a way that was hard to articulate but felt, somehow, right. Ruth Alderson, who was usually diplomatic about other people's business, said, standing at the window with a cup of tea, looking toward the blue south wall visible at the end of the road, "Well, I did not expect to live to see that." "See what?" Lavinia said, her voice carefully neutral. "That house changed color," Ruth said, "and I will note for the record that it has not changed in 20 years and that you have been in this town for 4 months. People sometimes simply decide to change things," Lavinia said. "People sometimes do," Ruth agreed, with a smile that said she was not deceived in the least. Albert finished the house by the end of the following weekend, painting through long days with the patience and thoroughness he brought to all physical work. And when it was done, the house stood at the north end of Harlan Creek's main road in its new deep blue with the white of the porch railings bright against it. And the April sky above was pale and wide, and the 2 colors together, the house's deliberate blue and the sky's natural blue, met somewhere in the middle distance and produced, in the perception of anyone looking from the right angle at the right time, something that was genuinely beautiful. Lavinia walked past it on her Wednesday evening walk and stopped at the gate and stood for a long time looking at it. There was an early evening light across it, not yet the deep hour he had described but moving toward it, and the blue was exactly what she had meant when she said light but clear, not gray at all, except that it was also more than she had meant, because it had his specific shade in it, the one he had carried in his memory for what might have been his whole life, the color of a sky that was still full of light but was beginning to hold its first stars. She heard his boots on the porch boards before she saw him come around the corner of the house from the back, where he had been finishing a section of trim, still holding the brush, a streak of blue on the back of his left hand. "You finished," she said. "Today," he said. He came to the fence, and they both stood for a moment on their respective sides of it looking at the house, and it occurred to her that this was the most intimate conversation they had ever had. This shared looking at something he had done because she had asked a single question, because she had looked at him on a March evening in the golden light and asked him what his favorite color was. "It is perfect," she said. He looked at her rather than the house, "You asked me once what my favorite color was," he said. "I remember," she said. "No one had asked me in a long time," he said. I had started to think I had forgotten how to answer that kind of question. "What kind of question?" she said. "The kind that wants the true answer," he said. "Not the polite one." She held his gaze for a moment. The evening light was doing its particular work with the colors, deepening the blue of the house and warming the planes of his face and turning the ordinary road to something more considered. "You gave me the true answer," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am glad," she said. They stood there a moment longer, and then she said good evening, and he said good evening, and she walked on down the road. And he stood at the fence looking after her until she had turned the corner by the schoolhouse. And then he looked up at the sky, which was at that moment exactly the color he had been thinking of his whole life, deep and clear and still full of light, with the first star just beginning to show in the east. And he thought that it was possible he had been waiting, without having known he was waiting, for something to return from a very long way away, and that it was coming back now, carefully and quietly, in the form of a woman who asked true questions and meant what she said. He went inside and washed the paint from his hand and made himself coffee and sat at the kitchen table in the blue evening light that came through the window from the newly blue wall outside. And the light had a different quality in the room than it had ever had before, warmer, somehow, more alive. And he sat in it for a while without moving, getting used to it. April moved into May with the warmth coming fully now, the grass on the range going tall and green, the cattle spreading out across the good pasture, and Albert's blue house stood in the spring light like a declaration, though of what exactly no one in Harlan Creek could have said precisely, and perhaps that was part of what made it so compelling. He asked Lavinia to come to Sunday dinner at the ranch house in the first week of May. He did it on a Friday morning in the shop, standing at the counter with his usual directness, and she was aware that this was not a casual invitation but something that had been carefully decided upon, and she accepted it with a corresponding directness, because she had been hoping he would ask for some weeks, and she was not in the habit of pretending otherwise to herself. Sunday came bright and warm. She borrowed Ruth's mare for the ride out to the ranch, which was 3 miles north of town on a good wide track that became increasingly pleasant as the town fell behind, and the open grassland opened up on both sides, the sky overhead enormous and clear. The blue house was visible from half a mile away, sitting on a slight rise above the creek that ran through the ranch property, and as she rode toward it, she thought that it had always had good bones, that solid 2-story structure with the broad porch, and now that it had its right color it announced itself with a kind of quiet confidence that seemed fitting for the man who lived in it. Albert was on the porch when she arrived, and he came down the steps to take the mare's bridle while she dismounted, and he said, "Welcome to the ranch," simply and without fuss, and she said, "Thank you, it is good to see it properly," and he tied the mare to the rail and they went inside. The house was clean and spare in the way of a man who lived alone and valued order, but it was not bare. There were books on shelves along the sitting-room wall, quite a lot of them. The natural history volumes she had heard about, but also others, botany, geology, a substantial collection of maps, and a leaner Shakespeare in a prominent place on the middle shelf that Lavinia noted with a particular quality of attention. There was a good rug on the floor and curtains at the windows that were clearly the work of a woman Ruth Alderson's, he told her, a gift when he first built the house, one of many kindnesses the town had shown him in the years after Alina, and that he had accepted in the spirit intended. He had cooked himself a roasted chicken with potatoes and early spring greens from his kitchen garden, and cornbread from a recipe his mother had used, and she ate 2 helpings of everything and told him truthfully that it was the best meal she had had since arriving in Texas, which pleased him in the quiet way that things pleased him, with that contained warmth that was all the more vivid for being restrained. After dinner, they sat on the porch in the late afternoon and she asked about the ranch, and he told her about the cattle operation in detail. The herd's composition, the breeding program he had been developing carefully over the past 4 years to produce better stock, the water management system he had designed for the property's 3 natural springs, the fencing plan that Santos and Emilio were working through systematically each year. He spoke about it with a care and intelligence that made it clear this was not merely his livelihood but his craft, the place where he directed most of his considerable attention. And she listened with genuine interest because it was genuinely interesting when a person spoke about the work they actually cared about. In turn, he asked her about Missouri, about her father's farming methods, about the teaching, about what she had liked and not liked about it, and he listened the way he always listened, fully, without the restless quality that people who are merely waiting for their turn to speak often have. "Do you miss it?" he asked. "Teaching?" "Sometimes," she said. "The children mostly. The feeling of something opening up in a person when they suddenly understand something. There is nothing quite like it." "Have you thought about teaching here?" he said. "Miss Carver is capable, but she would not need much encouragement to have an assistant, I think. The school has grown." She looked at him. "I had not thought of it," she said. "Not in any serious way." "You might think of it," he said. "In a serious way." She held that for a moment. It was the kind of thing he said sometimes, a suggestion that contained within it a gentler inference, which was that he was thinking about her future here, in this place, in Harlan Creek, as a thing that might be long and rooted rather than temporary and provisional. She did not respond to the inference directly because she did not think either of them was quite ready for that level of directness yet, but she received it, and she thought he knew she had. She rode back to town as the sun was getting low, and he rode with her as far as the edge of the town limits, a courtesy that she understood as more than courtesy. They talked about the new railroad survey that was rumored to be coming through the county, a topic of considerable public interest in Harlan Creek, and about the Edwards family whose barn had burned in April, and for whom the community was planning a work party in June. The easy movement between the personal and the civic, between the intimate and the practical, felt natural and right, and when they reached the edge of town and he said good evening and turned his horse back north, she sat on the mare for a moment watching him go and thought, with a clarity that was both exciting and slightly terrifying, that she was in love with this man. That she had been gradually and irrevocably falling in love with him since December, or possibly since the Tuesday in November, when he had caught the bolt of fabric before it fell, and asked if she'd had a reason for where it was. She took a breath of the warm May evening air, and rode the mare back to Ruth's stable and unsaddled and brushed her out, doing the work with the methodical care that she always brought to things her hands could do. And she let herself be happy in the quiet, ground-level way that happiness is at its most durable. Not a great bright flare of it, but a steady warmth throughout. A sense of the world being fundamentally, genuinely all right. Ruth was on the back porch when she came in, shelling peas in the evening light, and she looked at Lavinia's face and said nothing except, "There are peas to shell," and handed her a bowl, which was Ruth's particular way of saying everything she needed to say. They sat together shelling peas in the warm evening, and the sound of the creek somewhere below the town was faint and steady, and Lavinia thought about blue houses and favorite colors, and the particular way a man's voice sounds when he is telling you about something he genuinely loves, and she thought that maybe Harlan Creek was not a stopping place after all. Maybe it was a destination, just not the kind she had known to look for. The spring moved along with its usual business. The Edwards barn was rebuilt on a Saturday in June, when what seemed like most of Harlan Creek showed up with tools and lumber and food, and the framing went up in a single day with the kind of organized communal efficiency that the frontier had developed out of necessity. Albert worked through the whole day without stopping, and she watched him once from where she was helping arrange the midday meal, watched the easy economy of his movements on the framing crew, the way Santos Vega handed him lumber before he had to ask for it, the wordless collaboration of men who have worked together long enough to develop a shared physical language, and she found it quietly beautiful in the way that genuine competence in physical work often is. He came to where she was standing with a plate of food and sat on the sawdust-covered ground beside her, and they ate together in the noisy, festive atmosphere of the work party. And he told her about the time he had built his own house alone over the course of 14 months, mixing the mortar for the foundation by hand, felling and milling the lumber from his own property. And she found herself thinking about the sheer accumulated patience that life required, and that some people managed to meet fully, and that very few people managed to meet gracefully. "You built the whole thing yourself," she said. "I had help with the roof," he said. Santos's father was still alive then. And Pete Gruber's oldest boy, but the rest of it, yes. "Why alone?" she said. He thought about it. "After Alina died, I needed to have something to do with everything I had planned to do with her," he said. The house had been the plan, building it anyway seemed like the honest response to the situation. She was quiet for a moment, moved by this in a way she did not try to conceal. "It is a very good house," she said. "Better now," he said. She looked at him. "Because of the color," she said. He met her eyes. "Yes," he said, "among other things." She held his gaze for 3 seconds longer than she had held it before, and in those 3 seconds something between them that had been carefully approaching its moment arrived at it, quietly and without ceremony, and they both knew it. He brought her a wildflower the following Friday, a single stem of Texas bluebonnet, the state flower which was at the tail end of its season, found growing along the creek bank, and he set it on the counter in front of her without comment, with the same directness with which he did everything, and she picked it up and looked at him and said, "You brought me the color." "It seemed appropriate," he said. "It is," she said. She put it in a small bottle of water behind the counter, and it stayed there for 3 days, and Ruth pretended not to notice it, which required considerable discipline on Ruth's part, but she managed it admirably. June's heat came full, the way summer comes in Texas, with an absolute conviction that takes the breath for a moment before you adjust to it. The evenings were long and warm, and the town stretched its days out to meet them. Albert had taken to walking down to the shop in the evenings on Tuesdays and Thursdays, which were slower evenings in town, and walking with Lavinia along her usual creekside route, and these walks had become the thing she looked forward to most in the structure of any given week. They talked about everything about natural history, in which she found she was more interested than she had known, having been shaped in her education to think of the natural world as backdrop rather than subject. About the histories of the places they had come from, the layered and complex history of Texas itself, a territory, and then a republic, and then a state, and now a land that carried all of those transitions in its landscape and its people. About the injustices that ran underneath the surface of the frontier, the displacement of the Comanche and Kiowa peoples from lands they had inhabited for generations, a process that had been conducted with a systematic violence that Albert spoke about with a directness and discomfort that she found admirable, a refusal to pretend that the land he lived on had come to him without history attached to it. She had not expected this from him, but she should have. It was consistent with the quality of his honesty about everything else. "The land has a story before mine," he said one evening, stopping on the creek bank where the water was silver in the long dusk. "I try not to forget that." "Many people do forget it," she said. "Or choose not to know it." "I think choosing not to know is a kind of moral failing," he said. "It makes the forgetting easier, but it does not make it right." She looked at him standing there in the evening light with the creek running behind him and the wide sky above, and thought that she loved him, specifically him, this particular combination of stillness and depth and moral seriousness and quiet warmth, and that she was going to tell him so before the summer was out if he did not get there first. He got there first, on the 14th of July, 1883, on a Thursday evening on the creek trail with the fireflies just beginning to come out in the tall grass along the bank. He stopped walking and she stopped beside him, and he turned to face her and he said, without any particular preamble, "I would like to ask you to consider marrying me." I recognize that is a large thing to say, and I am not saying it lightly or quickly. I have been thinking about it for most of this year, but I find I cannot continue to simply walk beside you and not ask." She looked at him in the blue-gray light of the July evening, the fireflies drifting in the grass behind him, the creek running its steady course below, and she thought of January when she had watched him come through the shop door and thought how much she liked him, and February when she had begun to understand why, and March when she had asked him what his favorite color was and watched something careful and long-maintained begin to shift in him, and April when she had stood at his fence and looked at the house he had repainted for her, for a question she had asked, for the color she had suggested, and May and June and all the walking and talking that had been the slow, genuine, unhurried construction of something real. "I have been thinking about it too," she said. "Yes. Yes, you have been thinking about it, or yes, you will marry me," he said. "Both," she said. "Both things are yes." He exhaled once quietly, and in that exhale was the contained expression of something that had been held very carefully for a long time and had just been permitted finally to breathe. He reached out and took her hand, and his hand was warm and large and steady, and she held it, and they stood in the evening with the fireflies all around them and the sound of the creek below, and the wide Texas sky going its deep clear blue above. And she thought that this was exactly what she had needed without having known to name it, and that the particular quality of rightness she felt was the kind that does not announce itself loudly, but that you can feel in your whole body, in the bones. They were married in September of 1883 at Harlan Creek's small Methodist church, in a ceremony that was simple and sincere. Ruth stood with Lavinia. Santos Vega stood with Albert. Miss Carver played the piano. Pete Gruber cried, which surprised everyone including himself. The community of Harlan Creek attended with the enthusiasm of people who have been watching a story unfold for nearly a year and are very pleased with its progress. And the reception at the community hall was warm and generous and went on until nearly 10 o'clock at night, which was late for a weeknight in a cattle town. Lavinia moved her things into the blue house on the north end of the main road, and she arranged her books, fewer than his, but present on the shelves of the sitting room alongside his natural history volumes and a leaner Shakespeare, and she hung her mother's china cabinet in the kitchen and put her father's spare pipe on the windowsill, because it smelled of him still when the sun hit it, and Albert watched her make the house into a house that contained two lives, and he found that each thing she placed felt correct. Felt as though it had been meant to be there. The way the right color on a wall can make you realize that the wrong color had been wrong all along, but you simply had not known what right looked like. He told her this one evening as she was hanging her mother's sampler above the kitchen fireplace, standing on a chair to reach the hook, and she turned to look at him with the sampler in her hand and said, "You should have told me sooner that you were ready for the right color." "I did not know I was," he said. "I know," she said gently. "That is all right. The knowing takes however long it takes." She climbed down from the chair, and he steadied her at the elbow as she stepped off, and she kissed him in the kitchen with the late September light coming golden through the window and the sampler still in her hand, and he kissed her back with all the careful, deliberate warmth that was characteristic of him. And outside the blue house stood in the autumn light, and the range went gold and amber beyond it toward the horizon, and it was as good as anything she had ever known. She spoke to Miss Carver in October about the school, and by November she was going in 3 mornings a week to assist with the older students, the ones who were ready for arithmetic beyond the basic operations and reading beyond the simple primers. She was good at it, unsurprisingly. She was good at making things clear, at finding the angle from which a concept became accessible, and the children responded to her combination of high expectation and patient delivery, with the reliability that children have of rising to the level that is held for them. Albert attended the school board meeting in December and proposed formally that the school hire an additional full-time teacher and that Lavinia Trask be considered for the position. The board agreed without significant deliberation. She accepted with the direct and uncomplicated pleasure of a woman offered work she is well suited for and wants to do. The first year of their marriage was a kind of continuous revelation, not in the dramatic sense but in the daily sense, the accumulation of small discoveries about how another person moves through the world, how they organize their mornings, what they need when they are tired, what makes them laugh when they have had a hard day, where the edges of their patience are, and what causes them to go quiet rather than sharp, which was what both of them tended toward under pressure, the quiet rather than the sharp. They found that this was a compatible pair of responses to difficulty. They found that they were fundamentally easy with each other in the way that matters most, the unconscious ease, the ease of two people whose basic rhythms are compatible enough that the thousand small negotiations of shared life happen without friction most of the time. He found that she made the mornings better. She found that he made the evenings better. They both found that the combination of having someone to talk to and having someone who was content in silence at the right moments was rarer and more valuable than they had remembered. In the spring of 1884, a young Comanche man named Tabo stopped at the ranch asking for water and rest for his horse, which had thrown a shoe on the track north. Albert gave him the water, fixed the shoe himself at the forge he kept for ranch work, fed the horse grain and the man from the kitchen, and spent an hour in conversation that was partly translation through the limited Spanish they shared in common, and Lavinia came out at the end of it to bring coffee and sat at the porch table while they talked, and Tabo looked at the blue house and said something that Albert translated approximately as the color of the sky when it is deepest before night. And Lavinia looked at Albert and he looked at her, and they both understood the particular perfection of this. When Tabo left with his shod horse and a bag of supplies that Albert insisted on providing, he turned at the gate and said something that Albert was quiet about for a moment after, and Lavinia asked what it was, and Albert said, "He said that people who are careful with strangers usually are because they know what it costs to be treated carelessly, and that this house carries the color of people who have found their way back to something." Lavinia was quiet for a moment. "That is a profound thing to say," she said. "Yes," Albert said, "I think he was right." She took his hand where it rested on the porch railing and held it, and they stood looking out at the range in the morning light, and the blue house stood around them with its remembered color and its new life, and neither of them needed to say anything more about it. By the summer of 1884, Lavinia knew she was expecting a child. She told Albert on a Tuesday evening on the porch, the fireflies out again in the grass along the fence, the air warm and still, and she said it directly and watched his face, which did the thing she had learned to love about it. The slight opening, the warmth that came up from underneath the usual stillness, the way emotion moved through him like light through still water from below, suffusing everything. He held both her hands and looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, "I did not know I still hoped for this," which was the truest thing he could have said, and she knew it, and she held it like the blue flower on the counter, something brought to her as an expression of what could not quite be said by other means. Their son was born in March of 1885, a cold and clear morning, attended by the town's doctor, a steady woman named Dr. Frances Howell, who had set up practice in Harlan Creek 2 years prior, and who delivered the baby with a calm expertise that Lavinia was deeply grateful for. He was a big child, healthy and loud, with dark hair and his father's steadiness in the eyes even at a day old, which was Albert's observation and which made Lavinia laugh until her side hurt. They named him Henry for Lavinia's father, and James as a middle name for Albert's. Henry James Trask arrived in the world in a blue house in Harlan Creek, Texas, in the late spring of the 19th century, and the community received this news with the pleasure that a community takes in the children of people it has watched come together. Santos Vega and his wife Catalina came to meet the baby on the second day, bringing food enough for a week and a knitted blanket in yellow and green that Catalina had made over the winter, and Santos held Henry with the practiced ease of a man with 3 children of his own and looked at Albert and said, in a voice that was quiet and full, "Look what happens when a man paints his house blue." Albert said, "That is not exactly the causal chain." Santos said, "I'm not sure you understand causal chains." Lavinia, from the bed where she was resting with the specific exhaustion of a woman who has recently done an enormous amount of physical work, laughed, and the sound filled the blue house with a lightness that settled into its walls and stayed there. Albert took the first week and did everything, the cooking, the carrying, the quiet rising in the night, all of it with the same thoroughness and patience with which he approached all physical tasks. And Lavinia, watching him with Henry in the rocking chair by the window in the pre-dawn quiet, the blue walls going dark blue in the lamplight, felt something that had no smaller word than love, and that was bigger than the word usually was, an extension of it, love applied at full stretch. She returned to teaching in the autumn, when Henry was 6 months old, and Catalina Vega had agreed to come and watch him 3 mornings a week, which was an arrangement that suited everyone thoroughly. Henry was, as it turned out, an extraordinarily amiable baby who could be set down with a cloth toy and a clear sightline to the nearest adult and be relied upon to occupy himself for impressive stretches of time with the focused solemnity of a man conducting serious research. "He has your quality," Lavinia told Albert one evening, watching Henry apply systematic attention to a wooden block. "What quality?" Albert said. "The one where you are thinking about something much harder than the situation appears to require," she said. Albert looked at his son. "That could be a problem," he said. "It has not been a problem in you," she said. He looked at her. "That is very charitable," he said. "It is accurate," she said. "I am almost never merely charitable." He smiled at her, the full smile that she had learned was not given frequently, and was therefore, each time, like something you had been looking for and found in the place you had always almost looked. The years settled around them with the weight and warmth of good years, not without difficulty, because nothing is, but with a fundamental rightness that held through the difficulties the way good timber holds through weather. There was a drought in 1886 that hit the range hard and required every skill Albert had developed over 20 years of cattle management to navigate without catastrophic loss, and he navigated it, though the spring of 1887 found him thinner and quieter than usual, carrying the weight of 2 seasons of worry, and Lavinia learned that the thing he needed was not reassurance but presence, simply her being in the same room, or the same porch, the same acre of air. His awareness that she was there and would remain, and she gave him this without drama or comment, and he came back to himself by June, with the rains that finally arrived and the grass that came up green and abundant behind them. She was expecting again by August of 1887, and this time she knew what to expect and went through the months with a calm that Albert found admirable, and that she found was simply the benefit of experience. Their daughter was born in April of 1888, which was an April of extraordinary beauty in Harlan Creek, the wildflowers coming in waves across the range, the bluebonnets a solid carpet along the creek banks, the sky on the morning of her birth, a tender pale blue shading to gold at the horizon. They named her Clara for Albert's mother, and she arrived in the world with an emphatic, opinionated cry and her mother's green-gray eyes, and the particular quality of presence that some people simply have from birth, as though they have always been entirely clear about their own existence. Henry, who was 3 and had been told extensively that a baby was coming, regarded his sister with the polite curiosity of a scientist encountering an interesting specimen, and then went back to his block construction, which was probably, Lavinia and Albert agreed, the ideal 3-year-old response to a sibling. Ruth Alderson became Clara's informal godmother, as she had been Henry's, and she carried both of them around the shop at various points in their infancy with the complete authority of a woman who has been waiting her whole life for exactly this arrangement, and finds it entirely satisfying. She had begun to slow down in recent years, her knees giving her trouble in cold weather, and Lavinia had quietly taken on more and more of the shop's management alongside her teaching, and Ruth accepted this shift with a grace that was its own kind of gift, saying once that she had thought for years she would have to decide what happened to the shop when she was no longer able to run it, and that the universe had resolved the problem for her in the most pleasing way imaginable. Albert expanded the ranch in 1889, purchasing an adjacent section of land from an elderly rancher named Tom Delacourt, who was moving to San Antonio to live with his daughter. The expansion brought the herd capacity up to 800 head and required the construction of new outbuildings and an additional bunkhouse for 2 more hands, a project Albert approached with the same patient thoroughness with which he had built the original house 27 years earlier, though now he had more help, and Lavinia kept the construction books with a precision that saved him 3 weeks of accounting work. She went out on horseback on Saturdays sometimes, when the weather was good and Catalina Vega was with the children, and she rode the expanded property with Albert as he walked the fencing and checked the water management. And she asked questions, and he answered them, and she retained everything with the teacher's habit of genuine comprehension. And by the end of the first year of the expansion, she understood the ranch's operation nearly as well as he did, which pleased her in the way that understanding any complex system pleases a person who has an appetite for how things work. "You could run this place," he said to her once on a fall morning on the north pasture with the light very clear and the grass golden. "I could," she agreed, "but I prefer to run it with you." "Good," he said, "because I have no intention of leaving." "I know," she said. "That is one of the many things I have always been certain about with you." He took this in with that characteristic stillness and then said, "Have you always been certain about that particular thing?" "Since February of 1883, she said. "When you fixed your water line and I calculated the pipe length and you told me I talked like a teacher. No one had said anything true to me so quickly since my father." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the far line of the pasture. "I am glad you came to Harlan Creek," he said. "I am glad there was a house that needed a better color," she said. He turned to look at her in the fall light, and his face in that moment was completely open, that rare quality of openness that had taken her a year to earn, and that was, now, simply the way he looked at her, always unguarded and certain. "I have thought about that," he said. "Why I kept it gray so long." "What do you think?" she said. "I think I believed I was being faithful to something," he said. "But I am not sure any more that Alina would have thought so. She would have wanted color in things. She was that kind of person." "Tell me about her," Lavinia said. He had told her some things over the years in fragments, in the way people tell the stories of their grief when they are in a place of sufficient safety, not all at once but in layers, as the layers become bearable to expose. She asked now because she felt, and correctly, that this moment on the fall pasture was a moment when another layer had become bearable. He told her about Alina for half an hour, standing on the north pasture with the horses ground-tied behind them, and the autumn wind coming soft and cool from the northwest. And Lavinia listened with her whole self, and what she heard was the story of a young man who had loved well and lost early and had carried the loss so carefully, for so long, that he had nearly confused the carrying for living. She heard the gray house in it. She heard 20 years of Octobers with the same ash pigment. She heard the particular quality of his silence that she had first noticed across a shop counter in November of 1882, and that she now understood all the way down. "She would have liked you," he said finally. "You think so?" she said. "She would have liked that you asked true questions," he said, "and she would have been very pleased about the blue house. She always thought it should be blue." Lavinia looked at him. "She wanted it blue. She said it once when I was building it," he said. "She said blue would suit the sky." Lavinia felt the rightness of this settle into her, the way things settle that have taken a long time to find their place. "Then we painted it for both of you," she said. He looked at her, and there were 20 years of grief in his face, and also something that was beyond the grief now, that had moved through it and come out the other side into something that could only be called joy, the specific, hard-won, deeply rooted joy of a person who has waited long enough and found enough and is now fully alive to the gift of it. "Yes," he said, "I think that is right." By 1890, Harlan Creek had grown to the point where the rumored railroad had become an actual survey crew, and then an actual grade, and then, in the spring of that year, an actual line connecting the town to the wider world, with all the ambivalence that connection always brought. Prices changed. New people arrived. The town negotiated its own evolution with the varying grace of communities everywhere, and Albert and Lavinia were part of the negotiating, both of them in their different ways. He on the county land committee, she on the school board, Ruth's shop now formally under Lavinia's management as Ruth's knees had made the daily work too difficult. Though Ruth came in most mornings and sat on the tall stool behind the counter and supervised the world from there with undiminished acuity. Henry was 5 in 1890 and had begun school with Miss Carver, who was now Mrs. James Carver, having married the blacksmith's nephew the previous summer, and who had by that time been teaching in Harlan Creek for 8 years, with a consistency that had made her as much a fixture of the town as the creek itself. Henry sat in the first row and asked questions that made Mrs. Carver periodically look up at the ceiling before answering, which was, his mother observed, probably a fitting consequence. Clara at 2 was a force of nature. She had inherited Lavinia's direct gaze and Albert's thoroughness, and combined them in ways that kept the household in a state of benign eventfulness. She had strong opinions about food, about the arrangement of objects in the lower shelves of the kitchen, about which horse she preferred to be lifted onto, and about the question of whether the cat that lived in the barn should or should not be permitted into the kitchen, a question she had essentially resolved unilaterally by the age of 22 months. Albert found his daughter enormously funny in a way that surprised and delighted him regularly. He told Lavinia once that he had not known he had that particular kind of laughter in him, the helpless, surrendered variety, until Clara had demonstrated it with her characteristic efficiency. "She is extraordinary," he said, which was not a word he used lightly. "She is something," Lavinia agreed. "She is exactly like you," he said. "She is exactly herself," Lavinia said. "I had a hand in it, but the rest is all her own." He looked at her. "That sounds like something a teacher would say." "It sounds like something true," she said. Harlan Creek's spring of 1891 was one of the finest anyone could remember, the rains falling in exactly the right proportions, the bluebonnets coming up in such abundance along every creek bank and roadside that the whole landscape looked like a painting of itself. Albert rode the north pasture in early April, and it was a continuous sweep of blue from the creek to the fence line, and he stopped his horse and sat in it for a long time, thinking of nothing in particular except that blue was the right color for things, that blue had always been the right color, and he had simply not had the courage or perhaps the readiness to insist on it until someone had asked him the right question. Lavinia was in the kitchen garden when he got back, planting out the spring vegetables with Clara installed in a wooden box nearby with a collection of small implements and a determined expression. He dismounted and tied the horse and came to the garden fence and leaned on it, and she looked up at him and brushed the soil from her hands and said, "What is it?" "Nothing," he said. "Everything is blue." She understood immediately. She always understood. "The blue bonnets," she said. "From the creek all the way north," he said. "The whole pasture." She looked at him leaning on the fence in the April light. This man she had known for 8 years and loved for most of them. This man who had painted his house gray for 20 years and then, because she had asked him once what his favorite color was, had painted it the color of a sky he had carried in his memory his whole life. And she thought that the particular mercy of the world, when it managed mercy, was in exactly this: the way a simple question could open what had been closed. The way the right color on a house could change what it was possible to feel inside it. The way a woman with a carpet bag and a worn leather satchel could step off a stage in the middle of autumn and end up, by a kind of patient and unhurried accumulation, exactly where she was meant to be. "Come look at it with me," he said. She looked at Clara, who was currently pressing a small trowel into the earth with the serious face of a person conducting an important geological survey. "Give me 10 minutes," she said. He waited on the porch with the patient, settled quality of a man who has learned that the good things are worth waiting for, and who has all the time in the world now for exactly that kind of waiting. The light was warm on the blue boards around him, and the smell of the spring earth was everywhere, and the ranch spread out to the horizon in every direction, green and gold, and alive with the particular noise of a good April morning. The birds, the distant lowing, the wind in the fence wire, the sound of Clara explaining something important to the earth in a small, determined voice. Lavinia came out with her hat on, and they rode out to the north pasture together in the mid-morning, and the bluebonnets were everything he had said, a solid sweep of that deep blue-purple that is the most particular color of the Texas spring, and she pulled her horse up beside his, and they sat in it for a while, not speaking, the horses quiet, the color of the flowers moving slightly in the breeze with the quality of water moving in a current. "This is your blue," she said. "Close," he said. "The hour before dark is deeper." "I know," she said, "but this will do very well for morning." He reached across the space between the horses and took her hand where it rested on the saddle horn, and she held his hand in the middle of the blue field with the April sky above, and the Texas range all around them, and the house visible in the far distance, its blue walls catching the light and holding it, and she thought that it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the particular abundance that a life builds itself into when the people inside it are paying attention, when they are willing to ask real questions and give real answers and let the true colors show. Ruth Alderson died peacefully in June of 1891, in her sleep, in the room above the shop where she had lived for 30 years, and Harlan Creek mourned her with the genuine, collective grief of a community that has lost one of its foundations. Lavinia spoke at the service and said that Ruth had been the first person to extend her a hand in a new place when her hands had been fully occupied with carrying her own life, and that this was the kind of generosity that did not diminish with the receiving of it but instead multiplied, and that she had spent the last 8 years trying to offer the same thing to every new person who came into the shop with that particular look that she recognized because she had worn it herself. The look of a person who is starting over and is not entirely certain the starting over is going to work. Albert stood beside her at the graveside with his hand at her back, and Henry stood beside him being gravely attentive the way he was at the age of 6, and Clara stood on Lavinia's other side, holding her hand with the straightforward physical generosity of a 3-year-old who has not yet learned any version of restraint, and the Vega family stood nearby with their children. And the whole of Harlan Creek stood in the June warmth around the grave of a woman who had given the town more than the town had always known to count. And the sky above was that particular deep clear blue of the Texas summer that Albert had described on a March evening nearly 9 years before, standing at the fence of a gray house, telling a woman who had asked him the right question what the color of his life actually was. After the service, walking back to the house with Henry's hand in his left and Lavinia's in his right, and Clara riding on his shoulders, because she had deemed this the appropriate mode of transport, Albert thought about how many things you did not know you had room for until room was made. He had thought the gray was fullness. The gray was all there was after a leaner. The gray was the honest truth of what remained. He had not known that gray was actually a waiting, a holding pattern, a perfectly maintained not yet. He had learned this from a woman who had walked past his house on a March evening and asked him a simple question, and he understood, thinking about it now with the blue house in sight and the summer sky above it, that the question itself had been the key, not the answer, not the paint, not the color, but the fact of someone caring enough to ask him what he truly preferred, what lived inside him beyond the practicalities and the habit and the grief that had calcified over years into habit. She had asked and he had answered truthfully for the first time in a long time, and the true answer had, in the manner of true answers, shown him what he had not known he was still capable of. That evening they sat on the porch in the blue dusk, Henry in bed and Clara just barely persuaded toward the same, and the fireflies were out in the summer grass, and the creek made its steady sound somewhere below the town, and the horizon held that last long gold before dark. Lavinia had her feet up on the porch rail, and a cup of tea going cool in her hands, and Albert was in the chair beside her, close enough that their arms rested together along the chair rails. "Are you all right?" she said. "Yes," he said. "I was thinking about Ruth. She would be satisfied," Lavinia said. "She liked things resolved." "She was very pleased about us," he said. "Thoroughly," Lavinia agreed. "She felt personally responsible for the outcome." "She should," he said. "She wrote the letter." "She wrote the letter," Lavinia said, "and I got on the stage." "And walked past the gray house," he said. "And walked past the gray house," she said. There was a pause that was perfect in its completeness, a pause that contained all the things that had already been said, and all the things that did not need to be said because they were simply true, continuously, in the way that the creek was true, and the sky was true, and the color of the house at the end of the road was true. "Are we going to have another child?" he said with the particular tone he sometimes used for large questions, direct and quiet and without pretense. She looked at him. "I have been wondering about that myself," she said, with the same tone, which was how they generally handled large questions, the same level, the same directness, the same trust that the space between them was big enough for whatever the honest answer was. "I would like that," he said. "If you would." "I would," she said. "Yes." The stars were coming out above the blue house and above the town of Harlan Creek, and above the range that stretched north and east and west to the horizon, and the fireflies moved through the grass like small earthbound stars, and the two people on the porch sat together in the summer dark with their whole built life around them. The children sleeping inside, the ranch working in the dark beyond the fence line. The books on the shelves and the sampler on the kitchen wall and the china in the cabinet and the worn pipe on the windowsill. And the house held all of it in its blue walls, the color of a sky an hour before dark, when it is still full of light but you can see the stars beginning. The color of a man's whole secret preference for 20 years, the color of a question asked and honestly answered and acted upon before spring. Their third child, another son, was born in the spring of 1892, and they named him Thomas, for the man who had first given Albert work in Texas all those years ago, the old rancher whose land Albert had eventually bought when he was ready, and who had shaken his hand on the porch of his own house with the particular satisfaction of a man who has built something and is leaving it in good hands. Thomas arrived in April again, as though April had simply decided it was the appropriate month for this family's expansions, and he was a red-faced and thoroughly vocal newcomer, who made his opinions about the world known from the first minute, and who settled within his first week into a sweetness that was his own particular nature, neither Henry's systematic gravity nor Clara's opinionated force, but something softer and more open. A child who seemed to find the world fundamentally amusing and to be prepared to engage with it on those terms. Clara, who was 4 and had been anticipating this addition with a specific list of requirements about what it should be, inspected Thomas on his second day with a thoroughness that made Dr. Howell laugh and said, "He will do," which was, as Albert told Lavinia later, exactly the right level of Clara's approval to receive at this stage. Henry, 7 and serious, asked if he could hold Thomas and held him with a care that was older than his years, looking down at the small face with an expression that Lavinia recognized, and that broke her heart in the best possible way because it was Albert's expression exactly, that quality of paying full attention to something precious with every part of yourself. The summer of 1892 was long and full and generous, and the blue house at the north end of Harlan Creek's main road had by this time existed in its color for 9 years, and had stopped being notable in the way that new things become familiar and beautiful. It was simply the house at the end of the road, the Trask house, blue as the particular hour of the sky that its owner had once described standing at a fence, post in March light to a woman who had asked him the right question. And the town had grown up around its blue walls, the way towns grow up around things that are reliably and authentically themselves. The porch had two new chairs now, Henry's and Clara's respective territories on fine evenings, and the sitting room had more books than the shelves could properly contain, so that they had colonized a second shelf in Albert's study, and were beginning to make incursions toward the bedroom. Elinor's Shakespeare occupied its same place on the middle shelf, and was read occasionally by both of them, Lavinia having discovered a particular attachment to the later plays, the ones that are about reconciliation and recovery, the ones where people find their way back from long absence and great grief to something new that is built on the foundation of everything that came before. Albert found her reading The Winter's Tale one September evening, curled in the window seat with Thomas asleep against her shoulder, and the book open across her knee, and he stood in the doorway for a moment looking at her in the lamplight before she heard him and looked up. "That was Elinor's particular favorite," he said. "I know," she said. "You told me once. That is why I started it." He crossed the room and sat in the chair nearest the window seat, and picked up his own book, and they read together in the lamplight, with the sleeping baby between them, in the particular domestic quiet that is the deepest kind of peace. And outside, the blue house held the dark September night in its walls, and the stars were clear and numerous above Harlan Creek, and the cattle moved in the far pasture with the soft noise of large animals at rest. And the whole world in its immediate and personal form was exactly right. There was one more thing that had not quite been resolved, and it resolved itself in the autumn of 1893, which was the question of the gray paint in the barn, which still wore its original unpainted gray boards from the year Albert had built it. He had never painted the barn because the barn had never been the point. The house had been the point. The house was where the choice was made and declared and maintained. But now, on a Saturday in October, Lavinia came out to find him standing in front of the barn with a bucket of paint and a brush, and the paint was blue. Not quite the same blue as the house, a lighter shade, a working blue, less ceremonial and more practical, the blue of a tool rather than a declaration, but unmistakably the same family of color, the same fundamental commitment to the color he had always privately preferred. "The barn too," she said. "I thought it was time," he said. She looked at the gray boards and the blue paint and the man standing between them with his brush, and she laughed, a full and genuine laugh that came up from somewhere entirely happy. "Start with the south wall," she said. "It will look best in the morning light." He started with the south wall, and she went and got a second brush, and they painted the barn together through the long October morning, while the children played in the yard and Santos Vega arrived at noon, looked at the barn, looked at Albert, looked at Lavinia, and said to no one in particular, "I am going to need a longer memory for all the things I did not expect to see in my lifetime." By afternoon, the south wall was done, and they stood back and looked at it together, the blue bright in the October sun, and Henry and Clara had somehow acquired the small brushes from the supply box and painted a section of the fence rail blue as well, which was completely unauthorized and entirely in keeping with the day's spirit. And Thomas was asleep in the carry basket that Catalina had brought out to the yard, and the ranch spread in its autumn gold in every direction. And the sky above was the particular deep clear blue of Albert Trask's oldest and most honest preference. "I think," Lavinia said, looking at the blue barn and the blue house and the blue fence rail and the small painters responsible for the last of these, "that gray is entirely finished." Albert looked around at all of it, at the whole blue declaration of a life that had decided, finally, to insist on its own color. He looked at Lavinia beside him with the October wind in her hair and the green-gray of her eyes and the particular quality of her presence that had been, for 11 years now, the thing he organized his days around without having to think about it, the way you organize your days around sunlight and water and the things you cannot live well without. "Yes," he said, "I think it is." He took her hand, and she leaned briefly against his shoulder, and the blue house stood at the end of the road with the blue barn behind it, and the blue fence rail in front of it, and the whole wide blue Texas sky above it all. And the 3 children were loud and various in the yard. And the ranch was good, and the work was real, and the years ahead were open and unwritten, and full of the particular blue of a sky that is still full of light, but is beginning just barely to show its stars. The gray was gone. The color was right. The life was whole. It had taken 20 years and 1 question and 1 spring, and it was entirely, absolutely, perfectly enough.